Today we're going to be making best ever chocolate chip cookies. I found this recipe on Pinterest and it has an unusual ingredient, cornstarch, right there. And I really like the way that this recipe turns out. Now this uses butter, it calls for unsalted butter, but I added salted butter, and that's okay. It just means that when I get down here to adding the salt, I'll just add a little bit less and it'll be okay. Now I am doubling this recipe, so this is where we have to use our knowledge of fractions. The recipe calls for 3/4, so 3/4 plus 3/4 equals 1.5 cups. And the nice thing about these cubes of butter is that each cup is a half. So 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. That makes 1 cup and a half. Now it says that the butter needs to be softened. Usually that means it should be sitting out on the counter for about a half hour to an hour so it's soft enough you can indent it with your finger. I'm not really that patient, and butter's kind of forgiving, so I'm going to stick it in the microwave for about 20 seconds and it'll be just right. You just don't want it to be liquefied because that'll make your cookies flat rather than nice and poofy. So I'm going to stick this in the microwave real quick. And by the way, if you use margarine, you can't really microwave it because it melts way too fast. Its flash point will melt and it'll explode in your microwave if you're not careful. Butter, like I said, a little more forgiving. All right, we came back. And as you can see, this is a lot softer. I can depress it with my fingers. You can tell I started hitting the flash point here where it was starting to melt it just a little too much. And it was in for exactly probably 22 seconds. So, and you can see a little liquefied down there. So I probably melted it just a little too much, but it'll be okay for this recipe. This recipe is forgiving. All right, now our recipe is going to be calling for 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and 1/4 of granulated sugar. Now remember, we are doubling this recipe. So 3/4 plus 3/4 is 1.5. So here I have a half measuring cup. It really does say a half. It's just been used a lot. And brown sugar, you really have to pack it in. So I'm going to show you how I'm packing it in. Using the sides of this container, I kind of pack it in really tightly and then dump it in there. So that's a half. There's another half. And my third half. So that gives me a cup and a half of brown sugar in there. You can still see it's kind of like moon sand where it's really held its shape nice and great together. Okay, now we needed the granulated sugar. Granulated sugar is a fancy way of saying white sugar. So 1/4 and 1/4, when we add that together, that equals a half. This is a full cup, and I only filled it a half full. That'll be good enough. I've been baking for about 30 years of my life, so I've kind of guesstimated on some of these recipes where I know I can fudge it a little bit. But if this is your first time cooking, please make sure you pull out the correct measurements and do it the correct way. All right, eggs. If you're not comfortable with breaking eggs without getting shells in the container, I suggest breaking it into a bowl before you come in here. Like I said before, I'm pretty comfortable with it, so I'm all right with just bouncing them in here. However, if my kids were cooking, I would definitely tell them to break it into a bowl first, because there's nothing worse than biting into a cookie and getting a chunk of an eggshell. All right, there's our 2 eggs because we are doubling the recipe, and I'm going to let that sit and mix, and so it gets all nice and creamy. And because the butter is softened, it will incorporate really well. For 2 teaspoons vanilla extract, and then flour, cornstarch, baking soda, and salt. and milk chocolate chips. The original recipe called for bittersweet, but I'm a milk chocolate girl. All right, so vanilla. A little secret is I always double the vanilla in all of my cookie recipes. So this calls for 2 teaspoons, but I'm doubling the recipe, so I really need 4 teaspoons. Now, if I always double the vanilla of a doubled recipe, that means 2 times 4 teaspoons, which means 8 teaspoons in there. Now, a little trick. This is a teaspoon measurer. 3 of these equal this one. So I could do 8 of these, or I could do 1 of these, which is 4, and then 3 of these. Or I can just say, I really like vanilla, and I'm just going to do 2 of these big tablespoons. Now, vanilla is one of those rare spices you can get away with doubling like that. That's kind of my secret to cooking with my cookie dough recipes, is doubling the vanilla. All right, next thing it's going to ask for is cornstarch. Cornstarch is something popular that people use for pies. It's a thickening agent. I have no idea why this recipe calls for cornstarch. I just know that it tastes really good. And it's asking for 2 teaspoons, and since we're doubling, we're going to need 4 teaspoons of this. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if I was really a picky baker, I would put this in and level it off, make them perfect. But this recipe is pretty easy, and it's not going to really complain if you get a little lower. Baking soda is our next ingredient. It usually comes in a little yellow or orange container. My container got destroyed, so my baking soda is in a bag. So it asks for 1 teaspoon, but remember, we are doubling this recipe, so we really need, that's right, we really need 2 teaspoons. Okay, now it's asking for salt. It's asking for 1/2 teaspoon of salt. But when we double it, then it's a full teaspoon of salt. But remember, our butter had a little bit of salt in it, so I'm not going to do quite a full teaspoon of this, just a little bit less. And it's okay. Yes, I am a crazy cook, but my stuff always seems to turn out okay, so I'm all right with it. All right, we're going to mix these ingredients, and then I'm going to add the flour in. It originally calls for 2 cups, but remember, we're doubling it, so we're going to need 4 cups of flour total, and then we'll add the chocolate chips. Okay, now for the flour. 1. Let me show you real quick. So when I get my flour, I have it in these clear containers, and I smash it against the side and go like this. Now in some recipes, it calls for you to actually sift the flour, and that has a special contraption that makes the flour really airy and fluffy. And you do that for pies and cakes. But for this cookie dough recipe, because we're at high altitude, I actually really enjoy kind of adding, maybe just to pack the flour in so it adds a little more flour.
It helps the cookie rise really nice and big and poofy. All right, we're going to slowly get that mixed in and incorporated.
Okay, there our cookie dough looks practically perfect. At this point, usually my kids are running up here to try and eat it, and so I'm gonna have to hurry and bake it before they see it. Follow the instructions. You put this on a regular cookie sheet. You do not grease the cookie sheet because there's plenty of butter in there. It does not need any extra grease. You cook it at 350 degrees in the oven for exactly 8 minutes. Sometimes 9, but any more than that and it gets too dried out. I like my cookies to be crispy on the bottom but nice and doughy in the middle and just perfect. And they should poof up nice and great. You can tell you've got a good cookie dough recipe if it's nice and thick like this and holds its shape. And my cookies will be nice and big and wide. I love them. There's a couple other cookie recipes I'm going to add to this. A couple of fun stories about them I wanted to tell you about. There's a recipe called the ex-girlfriend cookies. Funny story, a friend that we know was dating a girl who made the best cookies. This recipe right here, by the way. And his mom said, you can't break up with her until we get that cookie recipe. So she finally, the girlfriend finally gave the cookie recipe, and then a week later the boy broke up with her. But that's why it's called the ex-girlfriend cookies. A funny story for a great cookie recipe. I really like that ex-girlfriend cookie dough recipe because you can use a cookie scoop and put them on a cookie sheet and then put them in the freezer. And then pull the frozen cookie doughs and put them in a bag. And they stay in the freezer quite good for a long time. If you want to cook them, you can just thaw them on a cookie sheet for about half an hour and then cook them like normal. So kind of an easy way to have cookies without the mess. There's also another recipe I'm adding into this. It's off of the Crisco container. It is the Ultimate Chocolate Chip Cookie Dough recipes on the back. Between these 3 recipes, I mix and match and make each of these recipes because I just like all 3 chocolate chip cookie dough recipes. Okay, thank you. I'll show you a picture in a bit of what they look like when they come out. Real quick, I wanted to show you this cookie scoop. This cookie scoop is perfect for making cookies fast. You can pile the cookie dough in it, and then it pops out the perfectly sized cookie dough size to make sure they all cook evenly and quickly. And I just really like this cookie scoop. It helps me make cookies quickly. Haven't the foggiest idea what size it is. It looks like it's about 1.5 tablespoons, but it just came from a kitchen store and was actually called a cookie scoop. Here's what the cookies look like when we just pull them out of the oven. This is how you tell if your cookie is finished. Look around those edges, you can see they are golden brown. It's a little pixely because my oven light isn't that great. The tops still look a little doughy and shiny, but that's okay. They'll harden up once you take them out and let them cool. So it looks like 8.5 minutes was my perfect mark. That cookie back there you can see really good. It has golden brown around the edges. These are ready to be taken out and to cool. See how nice and poofy they are? My favorite thing to do is when we're camping, make these kind of cookies and cook a marshmallow and use a cookie on each side instead of a graham cracker for a yummy s'more.